Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Module 4. In this module, we are going to be talking about race and ethnicity, as well as sex and gender. Now, for the course, I have all of this in one PowerPoint, but I thought it would be easier on you for me to break this video up into two sections. So the first video is going to talk about race and ethnicity, and the second video is going to talk about sex and gender. Let's go ahead and get started. For the purposes of your exam, as well as the purposes of just knowing, you should know the difference between race and ethnicity. As a sociologist, I get really antsy when people use race when they mean ethnicity, or later when they use prejudice and actually mean discrimination, or sex and they actually mean gender. So the benefit of listening to this video and reading these PowerPoints is that you are going to understand the differences between them because there are differences. When we speak of race, we are talking about a shared biological characteristic that groups people together. It places people in socially constructed groups. When I'm talking about a shared biological characteristic, I am talking primarily about a person's skin color. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a shared cultural characteristic. And as you probably remember from before the first exam, culture is the entire way of life of a people. So this is something that groups of different ethnic groups share with one another. That is not biological in nature. It could be things such as an individual's religion, the food that they eat, the language that they speak, the country from where they come. So I just wanted you to be aware of the difference between race and ethnicity, not just because you're going to see it on the exams, which you will, by the way, you will see this on the exam, but also so that you have a better understanding and a deeper appreciation for the meaning of the words. There are a couple of myths about race that I would like to get straight first and foremost. The first myth is that there is a pure race. There is no such thing as a pure race. Race is a social construct, and while it is based on biological aspects such as skin color, the fact of the matter is, biologically, we are pretty much the same. There is no pure race, there is no superior race, there is no inferior race. We are the same genetically at about, and I'm trying to remember this directly from biology, it's been a while. I believe it's about 99.6, 99.7% the same. Our DNA is genetically the same as one another. So when people start talking about purity of race and they start talking about superiority of race and they start talking about inferiority of race, don't believe that nonsense. It's not true. Genetically, we are the same individually, or we are the same genetically. There's also the myth that there is a limited number of races. And I will have you know that because race is a social construct, that is not true. Scientists cannot agree on how many different races there actually are. Again, keeping in mind that we are 99.6, 99.7% the same, you have to understand that because it is a social construct, things are changing over time. Things are evolving over time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And also, as I mentioned just now, race is not necessarily fixed by biology. Rather, it is a social construct. So be aware of that when we think of race. And keep that in mind, particularly when we talk about prejudice and discrimination. Now, I'm going to include some videos in Blackboard helping you understand how race and ethnicity are perceived here in the United States and how they have historically been perceived in the United States, particularly with the following races and ethnic groups: African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asians, and Muslims. And I want you to understand that this is not an end-all be-all list, but rather just a small taste for an introduction to sociology course to get you to see that there are differences and uh, differences in how different racial and ethnic groups are treated in our country. When we talk about race, we need to also ask ourselves, for example, what constitutes black or what constitutes white? When we talk about people such as Barack Obama, I remember back in 2007, there were two distinct schools of thought with Barack Obama becoming president of the United States. I had people that said, uh, yay, we have an African American president. And I had people that, and I'll clean up the language here, that said, boo, we don't. We don't. We're not happy that we have an African American president. But the fact of the matter is, Barack Obama, if you look at his paternal grandparents, you will see that or excuse me, his maternal grandparents, you will see that he actually has white heritage. So you have to understand that, as I said, it's not all about biological or genetic makeup. It is rather a social construct. Barack Obama identifies as African American, and many people in this country identify him as African American because of the color of his skin. The color of his skin is darker than his maternal grandparents. I should also mention the picture I have here, Rashida Jones from Parks and Rec, who whose father was Quincy Jones. He was a famous music producer, and her mother was I can't remember her mother's name. I blanked. Oh my gosh, Peggy Lipton. I'm sorry. There we go, Peggy Lipton. I blanked on that for a second. The fact of the matter is, we are seeing now in the United States more individuals who are biracial. And we're seeing, actually, that was a question on the census of 2020, in which biracial or identifying as more than one race was an option for the first time. And I'll have you guys know that we are seeing that historically in the United States, laws and attitudes have frowned upon interracial relationships. In fact, it was only 1967 that the state of Virginia allowed interracial marriage. And I also should point out that I have read stories that proms in certain high schools, particularly in the Deep South, were segregated up until the early 2000s. So the idea is that race is ever evolving and ever changing, and that's actually a positive thing. I do want to also talk about minority groups and stereotypes, and I'll go ahead. I know that minority group is listed first, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about a stereotype. A stereotype is an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration that you make towards an entire group of people based on very limited interaction, very limited experience. Um, so when you think of stereotypes, most people think of them as negative, and in some instances they are. Some instances they're not so negative, but the thing you have to remember about a stereotype is it's not always true. It doesn't always apply. As the saying goes, you can't judge a book by looking at the cover. Now, minority groups are very easy to understand once you take the idea out of your mind that we are talking about few people that are fewer in number. While that may be the case, it is not always necessarily the case. If we talk about a minority group, what sociologists are referring to are groups of people who are denied equal access to the resources of a society. They are experiencing oppression from other groups of people. And what I want to point out here is when we talk about minority groups as being not necessarily fewer in number, all you would have to do is look for one example at the Black people in South Africa. The Black people in South Africa make up over 50% of the population, yet they have historically been a minority group. They have been denied the resources and life chances that whites in South Africa have. Even though whites are much fewer in number, whites are not the minority group in South Africa. And I will mention to you that even though apartheid, which is very similar to the Jim Crow laws here in the United States, Apartheid has been abolished and done away with since the early 1990s. Blacks in South Africa also are still continuing to struggle as a minority group. I would also like to talk about prejudice and discrimination because these are words that people use interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Prejudice is a negative attitude that you have towards someone based upon their group membership. It's what I like to refer to as stinking thinking. It's wrong. And people's attitudes, there's not a lot that you can do about that. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's true. There's not a lot you can do about people's attitudes. Discrimination, on the other hand, is an action. It is acting on that prejudice, and it is mistreating someone based upon their group membership. There are things that we can do, things that we can put in place. We can legalize uh, discrimination and or I say legalize, I apologize, say that we are going to prohibit discrimination through legalization. So again, you can pass laws to prohibit discrimination. However, you really can't pass laws to combat prejudice. Hopefully, eventually people will learn that prejudice is wrong. And I personally think it's unfortunate that we have to pass laws to prohibit people from mistreating other people. But unfortunately, in our society, that's the way it is sometimes. We have to pass those laws. We're going to talk more about discrimination in a little bit, but before we go on, I would like to talk about two forms of prejudice and discrimination as well, depending on whether it's an attitude or whether it's an action. Racism is the belief that one race is superior to other races. As we've proven, or through biology, genetically, that is not true. There is no superior race, there is no inferior race. But the belief that one race is superior is racism. And then there is the term xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of or dislike of foreigners, people that are from other cultures, other countries of origin, and things of that nature. So just keep these terms in mind because you will be seeing them again on the exam. The way we look at race can really depends on the person. There is, whether or not you believe it, this thing called white privilege. And I believe that as a white male. I believe that as a white male, it is my duty to speak out on white privilege. White privilege exists in this country, whether people believe it or not. Believe me, fire will burn you whether you believe it or not, and cold will freeze you whether you believe it or not. White privilege is real whether you believe it or not. The fact of the matter is, it happens. Now, there are two ways that we can look at this. We can exhibit colorblind racism, by which we denounce white privilege as being not real. We say that there is no racism in this country, that everybody is treated equally, and we turn a blind eye to the systematic racism that exists in the criminal justice system, the education system, the health care system, the media. We can turn a blind eye to these things, and that is a form of racism in and of itself called colorblind racism. Or we can be more race conscious, and that is where we understand that our social location, which we talked about in the first module, our social location, race plays a big part in our opportunities in every society. And that is true here in the United States. Talking about discrimination even further, because there are two types of discrimination that you need to be familiar with: individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. Individual discrimination is where the discrimination comes from an individual or a small group of individuals. And there are some examples. For example, painting a swastika on a synagogue. That is a form of discrimination. That is individual discrimination. Be aware that it is one or a small group of individuals who are engaging in that behavior. However, Institutional discrimination also exists. And institutional discrimination is the discrimination that is found in the structures of our society. There's institutional discrimination, as I've mentioned, in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in the healthcare system, in the real estate system. And be aware that all of these discriminations in these institutions are much harder to prove. However, that does not mean that they do not exist. This is where I'm asking you to understand white privilege. And this is where I'm asking you to be race conscious instead of exhibiting colorblind racism and turning a blind eye to the obvious facts that there are problems with race and ethnicity in many of our structures of society. Historically, race and ethnic relations have gone on a spectrum. We are, at least I am hoping that someday we can reach the last stage of multiculturalism or pluralism. We are getting there slowly but surely, but not quite yet. The way that different races can interact with one another is through genocide, which is unfortunate. Genocide is attempting to exterminate an entire race of or ethnic group. Um, it's absolutely unfortunate. I know that many people, when they think of genocide, they think of the Holocaust, and that is a definite example of genocide or attempted genocide. But keep in mind that's not the only genocide that has existed in history. So. Then there is population transfer. Population transfer, for many of you that have taken American history, you may remember reading about the Trail of Tears. Population transfer is basically taking over the land and moving the people who were here first off to, in the cases of the Native American population, reservations. There is eternal colonialism. Eternal colonialism is where countries will go out and they will conquer other countries in an attempt to exploit their material resources. We see this a lot dealing with countries in Africa. In fact, I know that a lot of people in history will talk about Adolf Hitler as being one of the worst of the worst. And while I agree with that, King Leopold of Belgium over in Africa mutilated and killed over 25 million people in an attempt to exploit their land and their material resources. Segregation, which exists even today, even though it is not legalized in some form or another, it still exists. We do see issues of segregation, particularly when it comes to just self-imposed segregation, but that is a separation of the races, such as the apartheid that I mentioned, the Jim Crow laws that I mentioned here in the United States. And now, even though these things have been formally abolished, many people will self-segregate. So keep in mind that, keep in mind those things as well. And then finally, or I should say, the next step is assimilation. Assimilation is where the different racial and ethnic groups are expected to give up their cultural heritage in order to blend in or assimilate with the mainstream culture. Many people refer to the United States, for example, as a melting pot. And I guess the idea is that we're trying to assimilate into one culture. Actually, I would hope that we would be more of a salad bowl instead of a melting pot and become more diverse through this last step of multiculturalism. So if there are any questions on that, please reach out to me and I will get back with you. Last but not least are the perspectives on race and ethnicity. Symbolic interaction is the individual micro level perspective. Symbolic interaction looks at labels of race and perceptions of race and how they come to be. How our attitudes focused on our own race as well as other races. Structural functionalism looks at the problems of race as the dysfunctions of the races working together in society, that we are focused on equilibrium and we are trying to build a society together of different races and different ethnic groups. Any problems that come about according to the structural functionalist because of the dysfunctions of the different races getting along. Last but not least is the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective looks at race and ethnicity as a means of oppression, as a means of division, if you will, whereby the rich and the powerful turn the different races against each other so that they are able to maintain their hold on their wealth and power. That is what a conflict perspective would look at when it comes to race and ethnicity. If there are any questions or comments, please reach out to me and I will see you online.